Now I'm just taking some molybdenum paste, and this slot here is where that cam runs. It runs along that surface. So I'll put a little light white down there, and then drop this into position. The small pin on there is facing upwards. The larger diameter pin drops into that slot. Our second depth of field pointer now, I'll just clean that. You're not missing much here. I'm just doing this off camera because if I have the white paper towel in picture, it'll just make the camera close down the aperture and you'll see nothing. Okay, so here's our second depth of field pointer. Drops in the second position. The slot here on this depth of field pointer couples with the pin on that little cam that we've just been playing with. And of course I've got to get this thing seated down inside, and it doesn't want to go. Now that's sitting there now. Now getting the coupling right. We need to have both of our pointers at the extreme end of their range. So I've got to lift this up on this side over the gear and turn it round slightly and recouple it and just check that it's seated. Now I think I need to come another tooth. Now that's seated. The pin here on our cam comes up through it. This is seated correctly. This is at the extreme end of its range. This one down here, the first one's at the extreme end of its range. So that's all in place. Right, so now we want the piece that goes on here that couples to the controls of the camera. And I'm just giving this a wipe off camera. And if you think there's nothing coming off here, you'd be wrong, as you can see the black and filth that's coming off on this. You can lubricate these parts very lightly with graphite, say dry graphite from a lead pencil. Now that fits in there. That pin on the back couples to that little hole in the cam. No, that's not a unusual New Zealand native bird. That's someone's car alarm. So I drop that in position, and the spring needs to go back over the same post the other spring's on. That could get very annoying. So that's all seated and correct. It's sitting up against its stops, it's ready to go. I've got two more pieces here I need to clean. This one and this one. I'll just do those off camera. And then we get the exciting part of getting this lot fitted together. When we're done, if everything goes well, we'll have a lens where the focus is smooth and where the depth of field pointers and the aperture move smoothly, and the aperture in particular, the diaphragm closes down promptly when needed, which is actually more on the reflex camera than the rangefinder camera. Alright, so far so good. Now, this is the entertaining bit. We've got to get everything in position at the same time. At this stage, what I've got here are 3 screws that came from my stray screw bins, and I've ground the heads off them so they're just a cylindrical shaft with a slot on the top so I can do them up. I use these to help me guide the other components in place. You don't necessarily need them, but I can tell you it's a great aid. And to create something like this, if you can find the screw that will fit to do the job, and of course it can be any length because these are much longer than they need to be, put the screw in the chuck of a drill and then use your drill like a lathe and a small file and just file the head down until the head's virtually gone and you've just left with this slot. Okay, so what I do here is I put one here, one here. I don't know what that car alarm sound will come out like on the camera. Hopefully it's not accentuated unduly. And I'll put one in this position. You might ask, well, there's 4 positions, why aren't you using 4 screws? Well, I do have 4 screws, but I found from experience I don't need to use 4 screws, and so I don't. This piece goes grey side up, and you'll notice that there's a hole here and a notch here. So those 2 screws go into the notches at each end, and notch here, notch here. That hole is where a pin on the base plate goes, on the lens mount goes. There's a pin on here. Where is it? Oh, there it is. That's where that goes through. That's an alignment tool. This piece, this connects up to the tab on the lens itself to close the aperture. It sits on there like that. You can see there's a small tab on that ring below it, and that sits inside that cutout. So that's all sitting there waiting to go. What else do we need to do? Right, move the focus scale ring until this notch lines up. I usually line it up with that screw hole there. You just need some point of reference so that you can put things in the right place. Here's our mount, and this is what's going on there. Now the holes are not equidistant. These 2 are close together. They match up with these 2. My tab here for the focus that couples to that, obviously I need to line that up. Well, I've lined it up with that screw hole. I've lined it up with that screw hole. Let's lift this into place. So lower this down gently into place without disturbing anything. This is where those 3 little screws come in handy. That's not seating nicely. Right. This tab here was trapped underneath. Now it's not moving smoothly at all. I'm holding this pinched between finger and thumb to keep it together. I'm just moving my depth of field pointers with the tab. They don't appear to be moving as smoothly as I'd like. No, that seems to be okay now. And we can get the screws in here. Well, of course, one of our screw positions is empty at the moment. Let's just check, make sure I got my focus scale ring connected directly there to my... No, I didn't. So my focus scale ring, I've missed it. Right, so let's back out of here. If I'm very lucky, I won't disturb too much. Well, I did disturb a little bit. Let's put this stuff back where we started. Now, what happened there was that this piece didn't couple correctly with the ring on the on here. Now let's get this back in position. Just line that up with that hole. Take this piece, make sure that this is lined up with that hole, so that when I flip it, it'll line up with that tab there, and try again. This time I'm looking in from the side and I can see that it is lined up. Yeah, my depth of field pointer scale is not moving correctly. Something has moved there, something shifted, and it's not correct. Let's see what's going on here. This piece is not moving smoothly. Both springs are there. The pointers look like they're in the right position. But this has just suddenly got very stiff. Now none of those screws are touching anything. That spring, that should be sitting down in there. I suspect one of my pointers may be scraping on the focus scale ring. We know that they're a very neat fit to it, and with the wriggling and so forth getting them into place, one of them might be distorted. I'll close this thing up and I'll have a look from the outside, because I've got to put all this in position, otherwise I'll never be able to see what I'm doing. Let's get that piece back out, take that off. Put this piece in place. Put that piece in place. Have focus things in the right place. It's in the right place. Lower this over the screws. Check that that focus tab's connected. It's not at the moment, now it is. Make sure that's back. Now that felt like that was working nicely there. Let's get the screws in and find out. It may be that I didn't have it pulled down square and that's why it wasn't moving smoothly. I think we want 2 screws in here at least so we can see what's happening. And the one directly opposite that one, that would be a good choice. It's much more important with the reflex cameras than the Retina IIIS that the lenses move smoothly and freely. Well, that tab moves nicely. That's the one that couples to the diaphragm in the lens capsule. This one here moves our depth of field pointers, and that's snappy in its action. Let's check that the depth of field pointers come together equidistant, and if they don't, you can see that they're not correct. One of those pointers is 1 tooth out from where it needs to be. So that's in problem, and means I've got to take this apart again and move one of those rings. Seeing which one needs to move. This one is not hard up against its stop, so I think I need to move it over 1 tooth. So lift it. Trying to get under it. Move it across the tooth. That should be it. Of course, We'll get our third screw back in position here. These lenses are not normally this much trouble. This one's just doing its best to cause me grief. Okay, so everything back where we want it. Everything lined up. Lower this into position. Get the focus correct there, that's lined up. That feels good. Let's pull the lever around and see if those depth of field pointers match in the middle. They do. They're equidistant now, so that's all good. And the action feels smooth. Let's get the screws in quickly. Just noticed that car alarm has stopped beeping, so that probably happened 5 minutes ago. I've been too busy to notice. Let's get the two screws in, make sure they're tight. Check the action. That seems okay. Well, I think we're well on the way to getting this thing back together. Oh, that feels tight now. Okay. Yeah, it's most definitely touching the focus scale ring, because when it's in a different position, I can see that there's less clearance between the pointer and the scale ring. It means that this band, this thing here, might be out of round. It's fine at the infinity position. At the 10-foot mark, it gets stiff. I think it's this pointer here. It's moving freely now, and that back at the infinity position. That seems fine. All I did was I just forced that focus scale ring back. I think that the outer band here was just not in snug. Here. That's better. That noise, that rattle you can hear in the background, that's just their ring here rattling about. That feels good. That's ready to have the lens capsule put back in it. But before we do that, I better put its screws back in at the back of the lens. That's all good. Okay, so to deal with the lens capsule, I'm just going to unscrew the outer helical. Now the thread here and the internal thread here are both greasy. As usual, you want to remove all traces of the grease because it will have gathered up dust over time and become a bit of a grinding paste. This isn't a bad example by any means. However, we do know that this lens has been serviced at some stage, or at least had some attention, because the cone in the middle, I think, was this the one that the cone was painted and wouldn't come loose? Perhaps that was lens number 2. It's a multi-start thread, and if you look at the number of starts here, it's got plenty of places this can start. Just checking the feel of that. It feels smooth enough. It feels like there's still some grease in there, to tell the truth. It's moving quite smoothly. Oh, that feels good. It's nice and smooth. Okay, we can leave that off and inspect the lens capsule itself. Now I can see into that quite well. I haven't even cleaned the glass yet. I can see that the diaphragm moves quite smoothly. There's a little bit of marking on those blades, but there's no obvious oily patches that are likely to stick things together. You can see here the scratch. That tells me that somebody has used a tool there to open that up at some stage and it's slipped. Now they may have been using the points of a pair of tweezers, something like that. That's just an indication that someone's been here before. Right, so what I want to do now is just clean the glass surfaces. It's important to clean the outside glass at this stage so that you're better able to peer inside and decide whether you're going to need to dismantle the lens and clean any internal surfaces. So I'll find my blower. Just blowing away any loose dust there. I'm going to clean this with some glass cleaner, and it's just your normal domestic glass cleaner. I'll just moisten the cotton bud with it. And while you're doing this, keep rotating the cotton bud so you're presenting a clean part of the cotton bud to the glass as you go. That makes it much less likely that you'll pick up a particle of grit and grind it into the lens. Alright, so I've cleaned that, and I'm just going to use the other end of the cotton bud and just wipe that. I'll get another cotton bud, just moisten it very slightly. And that looks pretty good to me. just making sure that there weren't marks on that glass. It's actually a reflection of the clouds in the sky from the window beside me. Right, so I'll do the same on this back surface. Now, anytime you're using glass cleaner or anything liquid, put it on the cotton bud and use that to apply it to the lens. Don't drip any onto the lens or squirt it onto the lens or anything like that, because you can be sure it'll run in around the edges and cause you grief if you do things like that. Okay, so that lens looks nice and clear. That's a very good example. And that can go back into the body now. So what I want is some grease for the helical. Now I've got some white lithium grease. It's Helimax XP. And I'll use that, but you could use graphite grease or anything else, but use it very sparingly, because otherwise the focus will be stiff. If you clog up those threads with thick grease, it will be very stiff indeed. That's the grease I'll use for the helical. I'll just get a little bit on a toothpick. Not as much as that. I'll apply a little spot in about 5 or 6 places around the outside of the thread. Then run on the outer helical. Just work it backwards and forwards, make sure it's well spread. That looks good. Now to put the capsule back into the lens body, this has got to engage the body in 2 places. That brass notch there engages with a post inside the body, and that stops this part of the lens from rotating, so it can only move backwards and forwards as you move the focus. And here, this little fork here is what couples to the diaphragm setting lever in the mount. So I'll put a little wipe of molybdenum paste in both of those places, and I'm going to unscrew this front outer helical for the moment and fit this into the body. So, what do we have to achieve? Well, this lever here is what moves the aperture on the blade, on the lens itself. So we've got to get that coupled up with this thing. This post here is what engages with the body of this in this place. So we've got to get both of those together. So by swinging the lever here with my thumb, getting it all the way across to there, I'm going to try and engage that fork for the diaphragm setting, and then rotate the lens so that the other thing drops into place. And if I'm successful, you'll see the diaphragm opens and closes as I move that lever. Now that went exceptionally smoothly. Don't expect it to go that smoothly. By the way, this front piece here is left-hand threaded, the outer helical. So I wind that on a bit, make sure that my focus is set to the infinity mark here. Now if I put that down on the table, it'll just push that up out of the mount and I'll be having to put it back again. which would be a nuisance. If you're clever, you'd have some sort of mount you could sit this on while you were working, but of course I only do thousands of these things, so I've never got round to doing things like that. So taking my 3 screws and washers, I'll pop them into position around the perimeter here. Once you've got one in place, nothing's in danger of falling apart. Okay, so they're done up lightly. Now I just need to check that this will move through its normal range of motion. And it's not. I've got this. What have I done here? Something's not right. It's not moving through its normal range. Well, now it suddenly is. Must have been a particle of dust or something in there. So that's moving through its normal range. Now in this case what I'm going to do is, because I've got a camera body here, which I happen to know is set up correctly, this is my Reflex 4, I'm going to cheat. So I'm going to fit the lens to the body, and then I can use the focus screen if I can get this in the right orientation. That's better. I can use the focus screen to set my focus. So how do you do that? Well, your focus is set. This is in the infinity position, and I'm going to use an infinity target out through the window. Basically, if it's not, the images do not correctly align just at the point where the focus ring reaches the infinity position, then I need to move this outer ring left or right. And so basically what I've got to do is loosen the 3 screws and then move this left or right to either bring the lens closer to the film plane or further away from the film plane. So I'm just going to check out the window now and see what I've got. Well, you'll think I was cheating, but actually that's lined up perfectly. That was just lucky. So I'm just going to nip those 3 screws up. You wouldn't predict something like that. Normally you've got to make some adjustment, but I didn't in this case. Okay, so with the lens correctly focusing, it only remains to put these 2 pieces back in position. So these 2 pieces, I'll clean them with a bit of naphtha. Mostly here we're concerned with getting rid of any dust or grit that might be present. There's a bit of dust or something in there. Actually it might just be particles of cotton from the cleaning process here. The thread's probably a bit rough. Threads often are a bit rough, particularly when they're in aluminium. It doesn't cut cleanly. I'll just make sure that's all blown clean. In the cone section here, we'll just wipe that. That looks good. So back with the camera. Come on camera, hurry up and focus. That's better. This ring in place. It's got a tab on the top here that runs into a notch right at the top of the lens here. That stops this thing from rotating. put the conical section in. Now I usually find it best to start this thing manually like this. I'm using a wooden toothpick. Check that that moves smoothly, nothing's catching. Take my friction tool and just snug that up. No, that's not tight yet. Now it is. Okay, so that lens is good and that one's fit to go back on a camera. Take it off there. Just have a quick look at it. Make sure it moves through its normal range of motion. Make sure that the depth of field pointers move smoothly. That the aperture opens and closes nicely. The lens is clean. That all screws are done up snug. And that only leaves one task I like to do with these lenses. So I find where the red dot is on the outside of the mount there, and that screw that's right up next to it, I'm going to put a dot of red paint on there. It makes it much easier to see where you have the lens in order to put it back in place. So I'll just get a dot of red paint on a toothpick. That'll do nicely. So that can just be put aside to for the paint to dry for however long it's going to take, probably about 5 minutes. Just make sure there's no paint sitting on the surface to rub off. That's fine. That lens is good and it's ready to go back on a camera. So that was lens number 1.